Welcome to the Branding Room Only podcast, where we share career stories, strategies, and lessons learned on how industry leaders and influencers have built their personal brands. Now, let's get started with the show. Hi, everybody. It's Paula, your host of Branding Room Only, and I'm very excited for my conversation today with Elaine Lin Hering. Elaine helps people develop skills to communicate, collaborate, and manage conflict. She is the USA Today best-selling author of Unlearning Silence and a former lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. She is a branding newbie who is working to find and use her voice and stay sane while doing it. I hope that will help during this conversation. Elaine, welcome to the Branding Room.
Thank you so much for having me and for setting the expectation of me as a branding newbie. I feel more relaxed already.
All that I can do. It's all good. We're going to jump into this. I ask everyone at the beginning of the podcast, what does personal brand mean to you? How would you define
it? Who am I? Mm-hmm. How do I show up? I've been told that my personal brand is what people say about me when I'm not in the room. Mm-hmm. And I would hope that that actually reflects who I am, what I stand for, how I show up in this world, that there's a consistency between me as a human being and whatever this brand might be.
I think that that's a perfect explanation of it. I like to say it's in a room of friends, hopefully, right? So what are they saying in a room of friends?
Yeah.
So tell me, how would you describe yourself in 3 words or short phrases?
Human.
Mm-hmm, good.
That's a short phrase would be work in progress.
Okay.
And another phrase would be trying my best.
I love that. I think that from the initial sort of detailing, it makes me feel closer to you because it is vulnerable. And that is a huge brand benefit when you can get people to lean in a little closer initially. So you might be a newbie, but you're doing pretty good.
I'm so glad. I'm leaving this conversation already feeling more confident. Thank you.
Excellent. Our work here is almost done. Do you have a favorite quote?
I do. Mm-hmm. And favorite to me is always like high standard, forever committed. And so I'm going to say it's my favorite for now because it is a mantra I hold on to.
Okay.
And it is by Pooja Lakshman, who has the same publisher as I do. Boundaries are not co-created.
I love that. I'm taking that as my new, I'm going to put that on my wallpaper. I love that.
If I repeat it enough,
yes,
I think I'll be able to live it.
We believe it, right? Like it becomes.
And I'm a work in progress and I have made progress. So I'm going with that. Boundaries are not co-created.
I can't wait to tell my therapist I learned this. Anyway. Okay. On the flip side, do you have a hype song? So this is like when they're going to get full Elaine coming in with her, all of her glory, what song is playing? Or if you're having a bad day, what song needs to play to get yourself up there? And it could be the same song or a different song.
So I'm a person of faith. And so that song is Same God.
Okay.
Which reminds me that I am part of something way bigger than myself. That what happens today doesn't necessarily mean that, this moment is not going to stick around forever, however uncomfortable it is. And that there's just context for everything that's happening. And so that grounds me in a way that I can't, that I really need,
I can tell you that right now, in this time and moment, I also need that. So thank you.
Yes. You're welcome. Playlist.
Thank you. So what we do is take all the songs and put it together as a playlist at the end of the year. So yes. And it's leaning pretty well. It's leaning gospel. It's leaning gospel. So there's that. So Elaine, tell me about yourself. How did you grow up? Where did you grow up and how did that shape you?
I was born in Taiwan, immigrated to California when I was 10 months old, the youngest daughter in my family. And I share all of that because it probably explains why I wrote a book on silence. Right? Youngest daughter, immigrant family, patriarchal culture where boys are more valuable than girls. I'm just supposed to stay quiet, the way that I respect my elders is not have an opinion, not ask questions. And that serves you really well when you're entry level because you just keep your head down, work hard. Other people get to take credit for your work, the usual. And then you have no executive presence. You're not leadership material, except you're like, no, I am. I'm actually the one doing the work here. So that has been a process of unlearning.
Wow. I I love the connection to that, right? The thinking about our cultural connection to how we show up. I'm a child of immigrants from Barbados and Jamaica, and I remember very deeply being told, "Not so big, not so big."
Yeah.
Like, ooh, that's a lot, and just being like, "I guess I'm not one of y'all." Like it is what it is. What it is.
Yeah.
But culturally, it does. And it's why I like to ask this question because it definitely brings out more context for most of the people who I speak with, and so I love that it led to the book. Okay, so tell me about your career path.
I was that precocious child. When I was 11, I said I wanted to be a lawyer. I was on that path, right? Political science, speech and debate, championship, all of that. Went to Harvard Law School, fully intending to be a litigator. Came across Getting to Yes, an interest-based negotiation theory and practice, learned a very expensive lesson paying law school tuition, that emotions are okay to talk about and they're data.
Yeah.
And it was this mind-blowing experience of, wow, this is a skill set I did not grow up with, given that in our family of origin, we swept things under the rug, and as long as they seemed fine on the surface, everything's fine, right? Apparently, I've learned it's not just my family. And so I fell into leadership development. It started as alternative dispute resolution other than sue each other and blow each other up. What can we do? Turns out a whole lot. And this is a skill set to be able to communicate effectively. And as I was teaching that material, spent more than a decade teaching the concepts that my colleagues at the Harvard Negotiation Project created, a lot of world-renowned expert work. And I put quotes in that only because there's so much we could unpack there. And realized most of this material that is held up as expert advice is written primarily from the perspective of white men or privileged white women. And so there are blind spots to it and there are gaps, and Unlearning Silence is a response to that, to say there's a lot that's valuable in these skills for negotiating and having difficult conversations, but why don't some people do it after tremendous investment of time, energy, finances to build these skills? Because there's this factor called silence that we're not talking about, that is so deeply ingrained in how we grew up, in how we interact with one another, and the systems we're all a part of. So if we really want to create spaces of dignity, belonging, or just functional relationships, we need to acknowledge the role of silence. So I became an accidental author. I never envisioned writing a book. And the more I worked around this topic and researched, I thought, you know what, we've got it wrong. Society says if you're not being heard, you need to be more courageous. You need more confidence. Or if you're not being heard, it's because you're too big, right? Not that big as your family and culture is saying, versus in what ways might we have learned silence as a coping mechanism, as a survival strategy? In what ways do the people around me silence me by telling me I'm too much?
Right, exactly.
Right?
I hope y'all are listening. I'm just kidding.
Oh, this is an intervention for your family. I got you.
So I want to talk about in specific silence and how it shows up in women of color and other marginalized intersecting identities. And then I want to talk about what that might mean for their brands. So tell me how it shows up, and let's get a conversation about that.
Yes. So anytime you are minoritized, you carry a subordinated identity, right? Meaning you're not part of the dominant group. That could be race, gender, class, education, any factor. You are more likely to be othered, more likely to be doubted, more likely to be left out. And expert advice says if you want people to like you, want them to work with you, say yes to you, you need to mimic them. Now, as a woman, I've been given the advice you need to be more man-like. And we need to unpack, well, what does that actually mean?
Right.
As an Asian American, I can't be white. I've tried. And that proximity doesn't actually protect me. In fact, it's damaging because that whole question is framed around women of color, you're the problem. Go fix yourself, and then maybe we can talk. Maybe we can pay you. Maybe we can promote you, but maybe. And the trap of that is that then someone else has the power to set the goalpost, and then they change the goalpost.
Wow.
So if you haven't already gone down that path, just a forewarning, don't. It doesn't work.
I mean,
and we internalize it.
Yeah, like, so say more, because when you just said it, it kind of, it just sat with me for a little bit, because I do think that anybody who's listening who has ever felt othered,
Yeah,
it's going to resonate. And even if you are a part of the traditional dominant, identity, there's still times in which we feel othered, and that is hard. So I just had a moment.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Breathe through it.
Yeah.
Right. It's really, and this is why, to me, the frame around this whole conversation has been so damaging. It's
Mhm.
been fix yourself, do this, and then you might be okay, you might be accepted, versus, and the thing about that framing is the other people in your life don't have to take responsibility for their contributions.
Yeah.
It's a very convenient frame. It's not that leaders aren't leading well, it's that you need to, have more presence. Fill in the blank, whatever it is. And to know that silence is pervasive and sneaky, meaning one of the populations I did not expect to connect with on silence. I obviously write from the perspective of a woman and a woman of color, but it is wives saying, "Oh, my husband needs this because he will not push back to his mother."
Oh, that's,
Right?
oh, yeah. Oh, right.
Your mama's boy, and
Yes.
even though you've evolved in other parts of your life, you
Mm.
revert
Mm.
to the young
That
man
we
you
were.
once were, to damaging effects of whoever else is in your life right now, because you're not having those conversations. And so, even though it does fall along lines of subordinated identities,
Uh-huh.
really the question of silence, defined as there's not enough room in the system for your needs, your goals, your hopes, your concerns,
Mhm.
that you weren't invited into the mix or didn't think that you could ask, that you
Mhm.
have to bite your tongue or
Mm.
withhold, censor part of yourself to
Mhm.
stay in relationship or maybe be accepted.
Yeah.
Right? It's no way to live.
No, and it's that, when folks are talking about you have to bring your authentic self to the workplace, but what they mean is to be like us, or right, or to not be less like you, or as much of you as we can tolerate.
Correct. And be
Mhm.
as much of the version that we
Yeah.
expect of someone who appears to be like you
Oof. Oof.
versus your real
Yes.
self. And you cannot ask me to be my authentic self if you are not willing and ready to accept
Mhm. Mhm.
that authentic self, much less do you deserve sort of my finest energy. Now, the connection, though, to brand is really interesting, and it tracks my own lived experience, which is I spent all this time being a good team player,
Mhm.
building someone else's brand,
Yep.
making their life easier, their career better. You don't
Mhm.
actually think that you might have a brand of your own, thoughts of your own, an
Mhm.
identity of your own, because you're always second string supporting others.
Mhm.
And so, to me, the most damaging part of that is forgetting that you have a voice. If your brand is your voice, your voice is how you move through the world. That to me is
Mhm.
synonymous to brand.
Yes. Yes.
Then you don't think you have one of your own, which is
Mhm.
not true, because we're all unique human beings. And
Right.
so, if you're just you, that
Mhm.
is your brand. You don't realize that it's there because you just exist to do someone else's bidding.
Oh. Oh.
I know.
Oh.
I
Oh.
know.
When you were just talking about wives whose husbands have been silenced by their mothers, I thought to myself, what other groups were you surprised about who were navigating this silence?
I
Was there?
mean, if you want me to be, I'll be
Yeah,
honest. I was
yeah.
surprised that anyone other than my mother read the book. That's how deep the mental
Mm.
imposter treatment
Yeah,
goes
yes,
to
yeah.
making you think it's you.
Hmm.
And so I have been beautifully surprised that my Latina sisters are like, oh, that's what my grandmother said to me when she said,
Okay.
Calladita te ves más bonita, right? You're more
Mm.
beautiful if you keep your mouth
Oh,
shut. And I was like, oh, it's not just my family.
uh,
It's not just my like Asian brethren.
wow.
It is the human condition that even when we don't intend to silence other people, if we are not actively designing the way that we communicate, conscious that we are different human beings wired differently, and holding it that we are wired differently rather than you're weak or you can't cut it,
Yeah.
we end up inclining people towards silence even when we don't intend. And so there's a compassion and an invitation to say, let's really interrogate how we're showing up for each other. Because if you want to create a place where everybody has a brand, everybody can drive their own impact, that the underlying message is that you matter and you are enough as you are, what do we need to do differently day in and day out? What do we need to unlearn? Because very few of us, I think, go into this world to say, oh, I want to squash your dreams and your hopes. But we've all worked for leaders who have done just that.
Yes.
So both and, right?
Yes.
How do I show up, use my voice, build my brand, and how do I normalize that everybody's brand and voice is going to look different? And that is the beauty and the power of this world.
And it's valuable. And those voices, I struggle a lot with in conversation with leaders, and I work a lot in law firms with saying, like, when you silence, right, without using the word silence, but when you don't have people feel as if they can be and bring themselves into the space, you're losing out on the magic of them. And I equate magic with brand all the time. And it's challenging on multiple things, because I think that also means that you're not as good of a leader. And then they're not as good as the follower that you need them to be because of your leadership. Another group I just thought about, and tell me what your thoughts are, of people who become silenced. So not who maybe have been raised in owning silence and incorporating silence as much, but I think about folks who get older and become silenced because they're not valued as much in the workplace.
Yeah, completely. I do want to say that there's the difference between silence that is additive and strategic and the silence that is oppressive is agency.
Yes.
Right? So are you choosing? Are you choosing when and where to use your voice or to stay silent?
Right.
And so what appears on the outside as silence could actually be strategy. Or, you know what, you haven't created the conditions precedent for me to show up as my authentic self and bring my gifts. So, you know what, I'm going to clock in, clock out. But in the rest of my life, I know where my meaning and my purpose is.
Right.
And I think there's a health, going back to boundaries, there's a health to know in what context am I going to invest my time and energy, right? Each of us only has so much to go around. Now, my great aspiration is to be an 87-year-old grandmother. Because they seem to just finally get to the point of being able to say what they want to say and be who they want to be, and the people around them accept them for it.
Interesting.
Versus their expectations of who we need to be today.
I was thinking about it in a very narrow way, probably because I have started watching Matlock, the redo with, and a part of the underlying premise is that she's an older woman in the workplace, and so she's not seen or heard because she's an older. And so I was just thinking there, but you know what? There is an agency that comes from being able to, like, not give a damn anymore and have right. So
if you reach that point,
yes, exactly.
And in what context do you choose that? And ageism in the workplace is real.
Yeah.
So in what ways is there a responsibility from everybody else, whatever generation, to see the wisdom and experience you bring and not write you off? Again, it's the same thing, just from a different angle of what box am I putting you in and expecting you to show up in a way versus how are you actually showing up, and do I take the time to get to know you and hear you?
So everybody's going to go buy the book. So there's that. But what are some nuggets about unlearning silence? How do we knock down the patriarchy inside us to own our voice in spaces where our voice, as we have just talked about, may not be wanted or valued in the way that we want to be.
Yeah. There's a ton of practical ideas in the book. Let me offer a couple here. One, starting with, do you fundamentally believe that you have a voice? Right? That's sort of a decision node. Yes, no.
Yes.
If yes, great. Then we start thinking about how you want to manifest it, how that shows up. If you're at that, I don't actually think I do, or I've never thought about it, or it's been 20 years since I thought I did because the workplace and my manager have beat me down and life has beat me down, sometimes literally.
Yeah.
I don't make light of it.
Yeah.
Then I actually would start with some internal work, which is asking yourself the question, what do I think? And what do I need? Not what does my mother think? Not what does my manager want me to think? Not not the party line, but what do I, the individual with a brain and a heart and instincts, what do I think? Because over time, that reminds you that there is a you in there.
Yeah.
And then is this question of when do I externalize it? I would start with it's drawing from therapy a little bit, but if you had a voice, what would you do? Which is
work.
It's different than I'm just going to use my voice, right? That bar can feel too much. But hypothetically, if I had a voice, what would I do? And to normalize that everybody's voice is going to look and sound different. Voice is not just the words you say or don't say in a meeting, but how you move through the world.
Oh, yes. That's the brand piece. So I love the equation there, because you can say a whole bunch about saying anything.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So if you're an artist, art, right? If you're a verbal person, verbalize. But what is your version? And that your addition to that is actually co-creating a different world. Co-creating a different world that normalizes that we're different. And that's the beauty of it, that we're moving through in color rather than black and white or grayscale.
Yeah.
So there's that piece of it. And if you're someone who has never struggled with using your voice, I would also ask the question, in what ways might I be unintentionally silencing the people that I lead and that I love?
I think that, and I'm so glad that you pulled it out, because I was going to bring that up next, because I do think that a lot, probably most of it, is either unintentional, right? Yeah. Or I would imagine, particularly from, culturally, out of fear, right? That if you just, like I told you, my parents said, just chill a little bit, then you won't, make any waves, and then you can get to where you need to get to. Yes. And then also in workspaces in particular, I think a lot of people who are big voiced, even when they're not saying anything, don't even understand that they are giving permission. Yeah. And they're not actually giving permission until they say, I welcome you. I want you, right? I want you to, and in different ways, modulating that for different people.
Completely. So chapter 5 is 9 different ways we silence other people, even when we don't intend. Woo. One of those ways is we fundamentally underestimate how hard it can be to own your brand, to use your voice, right? If your identities, your voice has always been normalized. You assume, unless you're conscious about it, you assume that everyone else has had the same lived experience, which they haven't. Right. Yeah. Now, going back to the immigrant thing, there's also a question, and this is where the unlearning comes into play. Right? This is not just what skill sets do we add, but this is how do we interrogate the foundation on which we're building our lives and our leadership, interrogating and excavating what of what we learned along the way serves us, has served us, still serves us today, or serves who we are becoming. Right. And if it's not, that's the unlearning, right? I, as an immigrant, building upon the foundation from my parents and elders who came before me, am in a very different life situation. We're not in survival anymore as much, or worried about getting kicked out of this country. Post-it note, election, we'll see.
Right, I was going to say asterisk.
Yeah. All the caveats.
Yep.
And if I'm not in survival, just to put food on the table, then what obligation do I have to honor the sacrifice of those who came before me? What opportunity do I have to use my voice in a different way that felt too risky to their generation?
Oh, I think about this from the perspective of as a parent, now, and what this might mean for parents who read this. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about what serves you as you go forward and what messaging you might be, I'm like, why didn't you just tag me in it then? But anyway, but it's so true that some of those lessons and behaviors that we were impacted us, we're also continuing to give to the people we bring into the world or shape.
And that's the generational silence. Right? What are we going to pass on? What are we going to disrupt between generations? And I will say, as a mother of a 6-year-old, writing a book on unlearning silence while raising a young one I don't recommend it. And I have to consciously remind myself, I'm not actually trying to create a mini me.
Right.
My role as your parent is try to help you become you.
Yeah.
What is your brand? Even if it's totally unlike mine and I don't understand it and it wigs me out a little bit, but how do I celebrate you so that you don't learn silence and don't have to unlearn it and can be fully, unabashedly, powerfully you?
We're pulling that quote right there because
check in with me in 12 years.
I mean, as a parent of a 12-year-old and a 19-year-old, I can see where I have inflicted silence on both of them. And I can also see where I have unlearned some of the things that I was given and given them a lot more voice than I would have had. but the Lord is still working on me. So
and working on them.
Right, exactly.
Which is the saving grace.
Right. and how. But it's fascinating, because I reached out to you to want to have you on the podcast because I saw a post that you had made and I was like, this has to do with brand. This does, because when we are not able to show up as ourselves, it impacts how we are perceived. And if we don't understand that sometimes how we're perceived is inflicting on other people the inability for them to show up as themselves, that also impacts their brand as well. We jumped into the book, and I wanted to ask you before we got into that, so I want to revert a little bit. Maybe it's not reverting, maybe it's dovetailing into this. In the work that you do, you coach, women and minorities who are navigating leadership in majority white spaces. What are some of the strategies that you focus on with them to help them to find their voice, build their brand, while managing those challenges that exist because of who they are?
Yeah.
It's
a long pause because I always ask one question that I really wish I didn't have to ask. But that, as a matter of professional responsibility, I ask, do you want me to coach you to be you? Or do you want me to coach you for career advancement in this system?
Oof.
And it shouldn't, in a perfect world, have to be an either or. And sometimes it's not, but it has an acknowledgement that the system also needs to change. Otherwise, I can't, it's irresponsible of me to go in and say, you just be your authentic, powerful self, right? That's not reality. So the other part of my work is working with the dominant, often male groups to say, what are you doing? Because we can get a woman a seat at the table, but if at the table, she needs to just show up as the version that you expect her to be and take notes. Well, that's damaging for everyone involved. And you know what? The responsibility is not on that one woman at the table to speak up louder or more clearly or smile less or whatever it is. It is for the responsibility of everybody else around the table to create the conditions where she can bring those ideas and insights that are going to change the way that we work. But until there is that, and we got to be really realistic about what she does.
I'm answering the question for myself, but I'm going to ask you. Okay. You're on the podcast. So,
and then I want to hear your thoughts.
Yes, I want to talk about what is the intersection, what you just mentioned, and what people refer to as imposter syndrome or imposter experiences.
Oh. So anyone who has not read Rachika Tulshan Now Malhotra's HBR article, Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, go read it now.
We'll link it in the show notes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Of just who came up with this, what's the context of imposter syndrome versus what imposter treatment are we all subjected to all the time? I mean, that's my short version of it. And it brings me to, it is even more important for us to have our own thoughts and insights rather than just ingest the way questions and situations are framed to us, even by people who are world-renowned experts or best-selling authors. Yeah, quotes, unquotes, right? The whole system is centered around one point of view, one gendered point of view. And so if someone's advice is not working for you, it may not be you. But so often we interpret that as well, that's what the expert said and it's not working for me. I must be the problem. You're not the problem. Look at who it was intended for.
Right. So, the question came to my mind because there's a lot of overlap in what you were saying about, folks, managing how they are navigating in these systems that are not necessarily set up for their success or to include them. And I remember I did a fireside chat with Carla Harris and she was like, what is imposter syndrome? She was just like, we don't have that. She's like, I've not met with anybody with imposter syndrome yet, but I've seen places that did not allow for people to thrive. Right. And so I really wanted to call that out because I do think exactly what you're saying. The brand of imposter syndrome is a strong one, right? Yes. Where that it is expertise, it is all these things that people are like, it must be what I have, but
it's a whole industry with incentives to continue to exist and people who profit off of it.
Yeah. So all of you sitting and thinking, I definitely want you to read the article we just referred to, and obviously you're going to be reading Unlearning Silence, OBS, to think about what's the you there and what's the there that we need to navigate. But within that, I'm sure in your research and doing the book, there may have been some conversation or some studies about self-silencing, right? Because as a learned condition, which I do think is the closest thing to what it was, right? But it's like trauma.
It is trauma. It is and chapter 3 of my book, When Silence Makes Sense, is actually my favorite chapter. Because for the people who say just speak up, you're completely ignoring lived experience and data that has told us it is not safe for me to.
Right.
So why are you continuing to tell me that? Now it gets us to there are costs to staying silent as well. That self-censorship contributes to social isolation and loneliness, comparable in health damages and impacts to obesity and smoking.
Yeah. Yes.
Wow. Silence is a secondary trauma response, but it is community and connection that can buffer against the stress of that silence. So in the book, I talk about it as Mario Kart. There's a double pain badge that we may not be able to immediately solve the initial pain, whether it's a diagnosis, a job loss, the look that our manager gave us in that meeting.
Yeah.
But what we can solve for is the double pain of feeling like we have to carry it alone. Feeling like we are the only ones, because the more we talk about it, the more it's like, oh, we are all human, right? We have not, were you in that meeting with me? How did you know? And I'm like, because it's a fact pattern that gets replicated multiple times. And as we are working for systemic solutions to those initial pains, at least we can resolve the double pain of not having to carry it alone, not thinking we are the only ones.
To that end, I imagine that this conversation about your book should be one that a lot of ERGs and affinity groups should be wanting to bring you in to talk about and have, because it is them bringing together, community. And, I always say it's like our kumbaya circle, where it's just like, hey, hold on to me, I'll hold on to you. But this could be very powerful to be able to unearth some of these situations in the group dynamic in a way that is wholesome as opposed to harming.
Even if we're not a monolith.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Just because we share one identity that brings us together in our ERG does not mean we're a monolith. And it can be the reminder. This is why it's the invitation and the call to action for us all to examine what role does silence play in our lives and in our leadership. In all the directions.
So, I mean, you kind of got into this piece about folks telling people to speak up and how that can be damaging to them. And you talked about it in two aspects. One, in that everybody can't just speak up. There's stuff that's happened, but also in that when, I guess the when and how you speak up can be a strategic thing too. And I love thinking about that in the personal brand aspect, because silence can be very powerful when you're building your brand, and it can be extremely detrimental when you're building your brand.
Say more.
At the same time, right? So it's like, if, like you mentioned in the beginning, a lot of times when you first start someplace or you're junior, you're putting your head down, right? You're silent because you just want your work to speak for itself. And then you get to a point in your career, and it's like, the work speaking up was not enough. And now nobody knows who I am and how I add value other than that work, because I haven't been silent. And and
that as you were silent about it, the thing about silence is that if you're not telling the story, someone else is still telling the story for you.
Yeah.
And they're not telling it from your point of view. It's not a, firsthand source. And so someone else's narrative controls versus you even just adding that counter narrative of what it looks like from your perspective. So silence is not neutral.
Oh,
yeah. I'm trying to say, right?
It's so true. Like, if you think, I tell people all the time, if you think you have a brand, you're right. And if you think you don't have a brand, you're wrong.
Right. You have a brand, but are you driving it? Are you shaping it? Or has someone else said, this is who Paula is? And you're like, that's not me.
Exactly that, which makes sense in the encouraging folks to speak up in the way that feels, I always say, a little uncomfortable for them. Not quite comfortable, because sometimes that's our learned experience, saying no. So, all of you have heard me say before, growth begins where comfort ends. So get a little uncomfortable, but it won't speak up for itself, or it'll be saying the wrong thing. And I think that that's an important thing to hear. Yeah.
Also, whose comfort are you prioritizing?
Now you're preaching, Elaine. It's so true. It's so true. So another grouping that I think, and you kind of alluded to this with the mother-in-law instance, is this could be powerful for couples.
Yep.
Because I've been married for 21 years, and I know I selectively choose silence because I like my peace sometimes.
Yeah.
But I also know that it took both of us to have each our own therapist to find our voice in a very different way than when we were young, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and thought that just love would carry us through.
Those are beautiful days, though.
Oh, they are. They're so naive, and they were a little poor, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, I'm making the case for everybody to get this for their friends, because I mean,
you can't be in an intimate relationship if you feel silenced by the other person. Right? Silence undercuts intimacy. Silence means we are not connected, that I'm not willing to share with you because it doesn't feel safe or worth it to do so.
Wow.
Now, it's not to say that truth and love can't be painful, but that actually having those conversations, or letting someone know the version of myself I am today versus the version that I was 5 years ago. Yes. We're constantly married to different people, even if we're married to the same person over time.
Every day, every single day.
Hey, your brand evolves as the other person's brand evolves. And the question is, are we both going to choose to invest in that co-branding?
Yeah.
over time. You know, when you mention relationships, it really tracks the whole evolution of this book. Started as a business book because that was the leadership development world I came from.
Yeah.
And when it came to picking a publisher, I went with Penguin Life, which was Big Ideas That Changed the World, because you cannot completely disconnect learned silence from your professional life to your personal life and back and forth, right? We're too porous as human beings. If you really want to invest in your relationship, I would encourage a conversation. I'll name it, and then I'm going to give you the fine print. The conversation is talking with your partner of, in what ways do I silence you? Okay, here's the fine print. Only ask the question. If you are ready to hear it, receive it, love that person.
Yes. Yeah.
And think about how you want to move forward, because if you don't react well, if you get defensive, that you're going to cut the intimacy. But it sort of gets to the heart of the deepest, darkest parts where we don't feel seen or known, or we feel vulnerable, or in what ways I think I'm loving you well, but you don't experience it in that way. And so how can we better align that good intent? But you got to be in a really specific, ready place. It's not like a Tuesday night date night.
Right. And before the wine. Well, I'm glad you asked. I would also say that might be a very interesting activity to say to your children.
Yeah.
I definitely do not want to do that. But
yeah. I mean, it really gets down to how do I love you well?
Yeah.
Right? You as you, not you as a version of you I hope you would be, because it would make my life more comfortable and easy.
Well, thank you for coming to Therapy with Paula and Elaine. You know, I'd like to be surprised in my podcast because it really is, for me, I want people to be on a journey with me of learning at the same time that they are. And I can tell you that I did not expect the conversation to be as broad and full as it is. And it's so important. And I'm really glad that it has this breadth, because, you know, sometimes I'm very like lawyerly in the focus of conversation, or sometimes I'm very like whatever, but this is probably the most expansive and applicable to anybody who is listening, and that they should definitely be telling their friends about, because we all, you know, we talked at the beginning about the fact that you help people navigate conflict. And since you just gave me an exercise that's going to create conflict, I want to that it's such an important piece. I just think about where societally we are. Like, forget about the workplace. Although you can't. But just in general, that there's so much division and so much trauma that we're navigating, that some of that trauma is from folks feeling very confident in not being silent anymore.
Yes. That we are watching on our screens, on our devices, and it is a privilege afforded to some and not to all. And what are we then normalizing? And what world are we co-creating? Which takes me back to, you know, sort of internal locus of control and agency. What can we influence? We can influence and we have agency over how we show up day in and day out. Am I choosing kindness? Am I choosing to extend grace? Because this is a difficult time in the world for everyone.
For everybody.
For everybody. And I have no idea what's really going on in your life, even though I think I do. Based on whatever I see, the snippets that I can get. Which is also why the agency to choose when and where to use your voice has to sit with the individual, right? There's no judgment whether you decide to stay in a workplace or you decide to leave, because only you know what you're carrying and the set of factors that you're navigating and what you have tolerance and capacity for. And my job in supporting you, your voice, your brand, is to center you. Not to try to make you into some version of my minion, my bidding. I mean, that's undercutting everything we're talking about. But it is, there is just so much. And if we're not examining and interrogating what we've learned, those become the unconscious habits, which is how we actually live our life. And if we have one life to live, the question is, how do you want to live it? Because we have some influence over that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Which brings us right back to your quote about boundaries. because I really feel like when you said that quote, it just kind of, because I think it's something that we're all navigating. And it's the, when am I putting them up because I don't feel right? I need to protect in here. And when am I like lowering them because you've made me feel a little bit safer, and then we can be in communicating in a different way. Wow. Wow. So what advice do you have for 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 people who have marginalized identities when they are trying to be resilient in these workspaces that may be contributing to their continued silence?
Yeah. I have a mindset thought and then I have an action thought.
Okay.
Okay. The mindset thought is, if no one has in your life has told you today that you matter, let me be that person. Number one, you are enough as you are. Not because of what you can do or deliver, but because you are human, and being human makes you worthy of dignity, belonging, and respect.
I love that. Yeah.
And you matter. Your needs, goals, hopes, concerns, preferences, they matter. Because the system around you and the people you work with probably don't send you that message. So that's a mindset piece.
Yeah.
And then the action piece is, who's your team? Because none of us can go through life alone, whether it is building or maintaining or evolving a brand, whether it is showing up day to day.
Yeah.
We are more susceptible to the messages that other people send us when we do not have counter narratives. And so by team, especially if you're the only on a team, to use Deepa Purushottam's phrase, the first, the few, and the only, if you are the first, the few, or the only, your team cannot be the other people on the org chart, because it is unlikely that they will get you or that they are for you. You're the real you.
Yeah.
By team, I mean, who knows what matters to you, your values, how you really want to live life, and can nudge you in the way that you want to go.
Yeah, your squad.
Totally, your squad, right? But who is going to tell you that you're not crazy?
Yeah. Yeah.
Who is going to remind you that you're not the only one that cares about equity or justice or dignity when everyone around you seems to not? And that can be who's in your feed, that can be who's in your AirPods, right? The team is not just who's on your org chart or who you text, but also what data do you supplement to the onslaught that is coming your way? And what do you filter out and categorize as noise because of the values that you hold and how you want to live?
Yeah, what data are you letting in? I mean,
and what weight do you give it?
Yeah, yes. A lot to think about. So
send your invoices for therapy to Paula.
I was going to say, I'm like, now that we're all cured or on our way, I think that was very sound advice, right? To particularly, I appreciate the saying, if no one's told you, because there's so, especially since COVID and the way that the workplace has shifted, and that there's a lot of people who don't interact with folks except for when they're in meeting. Like, it's just, we have a crisis of loneliness. And then, people, that self-talk can become very detrimental if we don't have that, to your point, counterbalancing messaging. And whether that's social media or actual people, live people, I think that's important. Well, so I knew every conversation I want to have, it just goes by really quickly. And so one thing before I jump into my final questions to you is that you always have an open invitation to come back to this podcast to talk about whatever you want, because now me, Paula and Elaine, and our therapy sessions are going to be a thing.
I love it.
One. Two, the action piece that you mentioned about remembering who your people are. I just think that that's such an important, it's so, so important. So I say I have Paula's peeps, they're my peeps, everybody's listening. And so I'm really glad you all had a chance to hear what Elaine has had to say, because I think it's such an important message. So now, what about the fun stuff? What do you do for fun?
I love trees.
Oh.
like I'm in Northern California, so big redwood trees, hiking.
Yes.
I mean, there's like a perfectionist achievement aspect to it that I need to work through in therapy, but it just reminds me of that there's more than the computers that we stare at. This whole world out there, and a majesty to it. Again, not to diminish myself, but to contextualize.
I love that.
Right.
Love that.
As there's this glory around me.
Yes. All right. So everybody in my podcast gets asked these two questions. One is this. It is, what is your stand by your brand? What is a unique aspect of who you are that you will never compromise on?
Integrity.
I love it. Yeah. I love that. Okay.
There's a whole episode behind that and that long pause before, but you get the one word answer.
I mean, I think that's probably the word that has been used the most by any of my guests, and it always has a different weight to it. Like it's like integrity or integrity. Like it always sits in this way where you kind of get it, and I feel it. It feels very authentic to what you've said. So the second question is this. Branding room only is a play on the term standing room only because I'm clever. So what is something that is your magic? What is something that people would be standing in a room with only standing room only space for to experience about you?
You know what has struck me that I don't fully understand, and maybe you do, so feel free to psychoanalyze me. The thing that has stuck out from my brand is actually the humanity.
Yeah.
Right? That in an AI chatbot world, being human is rare and powerful because it is the least common denominator. And so it's been incredibly freeing for me to just get to be me rather than the versions of myself I think I should be as someone who went to Harvard Law School or taught there or has done this work or that work or fill in the blank role, and to see the response that being human almost gives other people license to be human as well in a standing room. Like we're hungry to get to be human, which feels completely ridiculous. And yet is so, there's a hunger for that.
Yeah, there's there's a presence in that, because to the point of us being disconnected physically and also ideologically, like in a lot of places, I can see that. And I would say that what you said resonates because I feel a connection to you, even though we have just had the opportunity to be. And so your humanity does resonate. And so from the beginning of this, when you said you were a brand newbie, clearly you've been doing this for a long time.
I've been me for a long time.
and
I didn't realize it was a brand.
And branding that is authentic and unique to you is one that sticks the most, right? It's the one where we connect the most because you don't have to try, right? It's just how you show up. And I'm so happy that you came on the podcast and we could talk about you being you and how we could be we a little bit better than we had since before this conversation. Tell everybody how they can learn more about you and your work and connect with you.
Yeah, ElaineLinHering.com. I'm most active on LinkedIn, sort of where I rant the most.
Same.
And I have a free monthly newsletter on how to use your voice, create spaces of voice. So would love to connect and be human together. And Paula, thank you for helping me see myself more clearly.
Oh, I love that. Everybody, go tell a friend, especially that one you know who is too silent or who's silencing others, and buy this book. And as always, remember to stand by your brand. And I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.